Well, welcome to the video series, Embracing Your Kingdom Platform, How to Become a Leader That's Easy to Follow. I'm Dave Rhodes,
And I'm Shane Stacy.
and we'll be your guides on this journey. On this journey, we're going to talk about how to increase your influence and impact no matter what your leadership capacity is. So whether you're leading thousands of people or just a few, this whole video series is really going to be dedicated to helping you get obstacles out of the way so that people can follow you where you're leading them and so that they can become who they need to become on the journey. Let's start the first video series with this question. When is the first time you realized that God could use you? I remember for me, I was 6 years old. We were helping my grandparents move in down the street. I lived in Greenville, South Carolina at the time. And what I remember about that day is as we were moving them in, we really took some time to just get to know people around us. And one of the houses down the road had a boy about my age that we just spent a whole lot of time playing together that day. But the thing that I remember most about that day is him and I ending up in the back of my grandfather's pickup truck. And before you know it, we were praying and he received Christ as his savior. And I'll never forget that, not just because of that day, but because of the way my dad celebrated on a Wednesday night and Sunday at church, just sharing the story. And as my dad would share the story, it just began to dawn on me, wow, I'm just 6 years old, but God can use me. Maybe another time in my life that wasn't too far removed from that was when I was about 16 years old and I preached my first sermon at church. And I had never done that before. It was a new experience for me. We were doing a youth Sunday kind of youth takeover thing. Got an opportunity to do that. And I just remember God using me there. How about you, Shane?
Man, I think of when I was 16 as well, Dave, I was part of a large youth group, and we had a youth pastor who had gathered some of us, just a handful of us that he was truly discipling, and we were studying through the life of Christ together. And remember Rudy made this challenge to us. He just said, I want you to begin praying about the friends that you have around you, and that God would stir in their heart to desire him the way that you desire him. And I remember, man, I started praying for weeks, and I was like, I don't know, Rudy, I know what you do, but I don't know that I can do what you do in the same kind of way. And I'll never forget, it was a Friday night. A couple friends were over. We had a BB gun war in our basement. And again, obviously teenagers, our frontal lobe wasn't fully developed. And yet afterwards, some of the guys left and a few stuck around, and Adam and Charlie were sitting there. I don't remember exactly how it all even happened, but the conversation turned into what life was really all about, conversations about God. And we sat there and talked for probably about an hour and a half, these open conversations about who is this, is there really a God, and what's he really like? And I didn't baptize Adam in our bathtub that night or anything like that. But it did open up the doors over the next several months to have multiple conversations. And he did ultimately put his faith and trust in Jesus. But I remember Dave laying down in the bed that night and thinking to myself, holy cow, God is real. Not only is he real, but he hears my prayers. And if he can use a knucklehead like me, it's really pretty unbelievable. Pretty unbelievable.
Yeah, it is. And we want to ask that question because I think it's an important question that really talks about this hinge moment of leadership. Shane, as you and I work with a lot of churches, we talk about two hinge moments. First hinge moment is the moment of discipleship. And the hinge moment of discipleship is the first time you hear God speak to you for yourself. And as you hear God speak to you, you have to decide whether you're going to act on that or not. So we say, that hinge moment of discipleship is the first time you hear God speak to you. And then the hinge issue of discipleship is trust. Can I trust God? And really all discipleship is this movement of beginning to act on the things that God tells you. Faith, I would define it this way, is hearing the voice of God and trusting the heart of God enough to act on what you've heard. But if that's the hinge moment of discipleship, then the hinge moment of leadership is this first time that you realize that God could use you. And you walk away from that moment saying, if God used me here, where else could he use me for influence and impact in the world? And if the hinge issue of discipleship is, can I trust God? Then the hinge issue of leadership is, can God trust me? So in this video series, that's the kind of thing that we're going to talk about. We're talking about this journey from discipleship to leadership. And we're going to be talking about what we need to grow in as leaders so that we can make that journey successful?
Yeah, friend, you have been created and designed by God to be a leader, a kingdom influence in the everyday places of life. And there's a difference though from knowing that you've been created and designed to be a leader, and then knowing how to be the kind of leader that is easy for others to follow. And so that's what this course really is all about. We're going to help you embrace your kingdom platform, the people, the place, or the problem that God's inviting you to make an eternal difference in. And whether you're a church staff member or whether you're an everyday leader, this is really going to be for you. If you're a church staff member who's wanting to train more and more people to live into their full kingdom potential, this course is for you. If you're an everyday emerging leader who's just simply wanting to join God in what He's designed you for, this course is going to be very practical, and you're going to find a lot that you can benefit from in it.
So we're going to start today in Mark chapter 3. And remember, the Gospel of Mark is a gospel of immediacy. So we pick Jesus up not at his birth in the Gospel of Mark, but at the beginning of his ministry. And all throughout Mark, he's getting right to it. Mark chapter 1 and 2, Jesus comes on the scene. In verse 14, he says, the time has come. And he uses the word kairos there. It's different than another Greek word he could use for time, which is chronos, which means, kind of TikTok time. Like we get chronological time from the idea of chronos. And in Mark chapter 1 and 2, Jesus is doing this, and we're seeing people getting healed. There's a guy with leprosy that gets clean in a way that was really unthinkable in Jesus's day, because most of the time, clean things and unclean clean things and unclean things were separated from each other. And yet Jesus touches this guy and he gets clean. Mark chapter 2, there's a guy who's been paralyzed, and thankfully he has 4 friends who lower him down, and Jesus heals him and says his sins have been forgiven. And then in Mark chapter 2, he's also opening up tables for people who have never had a seat at the table. Tax collectors and sinners are now sitting at the table with Jesus. And by the time we get to Mark chapter 3, when Jesus heals a guy on the Sabbath day, the religious institution of Jesus's day has really had enough. When he heals the guy on the Sabbath day that has a shriveled hand, the Pharisees leave that moment saying, we got to kill him. They leave that moment saying, we've got to detour Jesus's ministry. But it's right after this moment that Jesus makes a move in his ministry to ensure the future. The Pharisees are trying to detour Jesus's ministry and future, and it's what he does next that ensures the future of his ministry. Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 19. Here's what the scripture says. Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed them 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter; James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John, to him he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder; Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. It's an important moment. You could just kind of pass over this if you're not careful in scripture. But here, as the Pharisees are trying to shut Jesus down, Jesus makes a move where he calls his disciples. He calls 12 people to him. And that's a strong word there. It's the word that we get the idea of he elects, he chooses them. And he not only calls them, but he calls them to be with him. He's going to name them. In other words, he's calling them to be with him. But when he looks at them, he sees them not just for who they are, but for who they could be, who they should be. We get this idea of Simon becomes Peter in Jesus's ministry. James and John, the sons of thunder. And there's an idea here that literally he gives everyone a nickname, because this list of disciples, the names are a little bit different than other lists. A lot of scholars think that this is Jesus kind of renaming or nicknaming all of his disciples. And he calls them to be with him. So he doesn't just call them, he trains them. And as they're with him and they're trained by him, eventually he sends them out. So he calls disciples, but he sees leaders. And not only does he see leaders, he sends missionary leaders uh, to the mission field where they live, work, and play. This is very different than the way that we normally think about things, because most of the time in our churches, what we do is we make converts that become volunteers that serve. And we're always trying to fill what I would call that volunteer drain pipe. We're trying to, get people to come to faith, and then we're trying to get them connected to the church and then maybe serving. And it's not that that is inaccurate. It's just that a lot of times when we think about that, and I know you're going to talk to us about this in just a moment, Shane, that this is just inadequate with what Jesus is doing. And so I want to just speak a word for you at the beginning of the series, that even though Jesus is calling you to discipleship, he sees you as a potential leader to be sent on mission to where you live, work, and play. And this is something we need not only in our churches, but for everyday missionaries to take hold of, because far too many times, we think, well, we're just trying to check the box of just maybe getting into a small group and serving. And I want you to hear right now that Jesus sees you as a leader, and he wants to develop your leadership capacity so that you can be effective where you live, work, and play.
Love that, Dave. I mean, the reality of seeing what Jesus actually is calling us to, and we often say that one way to think about this is we say a picture speaks 1,000 words, and maybe a picture that might be helpful to us to even understand a little bit more of what do we see experiencing, not only in the life of Jesus, but actually what do we see happening a lot of times in the local church, and what maybe is God stirring us afresh up for is a picture of two different funnels. The church in North America has this incredible opportunity to be more than just a teaching center, but to be a training center. And most churches in North America have some sort of a semblance of what we might call this, assimilation funnel. And it's a way to help people take next steps to get more involved in the programs and in the life of the church. And there's lots of variations of this throughout, churches across the country. You and I, we've worked with thousands of churches. We could probably sum it up into kind of these three normal steps, which is helping people attend, and then helping them get connected, and then helping them serve. And as you just said a moment ago, it's helpful in that it helps converts oftentimes become volunteers who serve. But there's a lot of meaningful and helpful things that happen in things like worship services and small groups and service teams, no doubt. But I have a hunch that if you're watching this video, you're longing for something more. You've read the Gospels, you see what Jesus is up to and what he's doing with his disciples and how he's sending them out and to be a force for good. And there's a longing in your own heart to be making a real difference in the people and in the places where you spend the majority of your time. And so we want to couple to this what we describe as, and what we really see in Jesus's ministry is this multiplication funnel. While Jesus engaged the crowds, no doubt, he spent an inordinate amount of time calling, training, and sending disciples as kingdom leaders, as agents of the mission. And he discharged his authority to them and empowered them not only to be helping him with his ministry, but empowering them to step into their kingdom platform, the relational spheres of influence that God's designed for them and specifically for them to reach. And the numbers that you see up here in this funnel really correlate with what we see in the life of Jesus. At Luke 8:1, we see Jesus doing the ministry. In Luke 9:1, he's called those 12 and he sent them out and trained them and then sent them out into the places where they live, work, and play. And then that just continues to move. Luke 10, it's the 72. And in Acts 1, it's 120 who are being deployed to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and even to the ends of the earth.
Yeah, so I love this because Jesus's ministry here in Mark chapter 3, he's been ministering to the crowds and the crowds are receiving him, but he knows the future of his ministry is really built upon the disciples that he makes that become leaders that then get sent out on mission. So here's the big thought for this first session in our series together. The future of our ministry or your church depends not on the crowds that gather, but on the disciples that scatter. Not on the crowds that are that fade, but on the disciples that are made. And in this series, we're really looking at this transition from being a disciple to being a leader. So many times when we think about discipleship, we simply think about the formation of the person, but our discipleship doesn't extend to them becoming a disciple maker. It's at this moment when we go from just simply being a disciple to a disciple maker that we make that transition from discipleship to leadership. And again, we see this in Jesus's call in Matthew chapter 28. He tells us all go and make disciples. So in other words, all throughout Jesus's ministry, he's calling disciples, but he's seeing leaders, and he sees a latent leadership capacity in every human being. And what I love about him is he calls that out of him. So in this first, video series, I want you to hear us calling that out of you. You have latent leadership capability inside of you. And this video series is about taking hold of that and extending discipleship to include leadership development as we send out missionaries to where people live, work, and play. Well, with that said, Shane, as we talk about that, probably in people's mind, a couple of different gaps are emerging that are at least worth naming here. We'll go further in detail in video 2 through this series, but go ahead and name some of those gaps for us as we close down our time today.
Absolutely. There's a few gaps that surface, right? And maybe even in the minds of people who are listening, there's a big gap between conversion and discipleship. A move from saying yes to Jesus and then to apprenticing our lives around Jesus. There's a gap between volunteering and leading, gaining the skills that are needed to not just run a church more effectively, while that's important, but gaining the skills to be able to be a reproducing disciple of Jesus out in everyday life. And then also that gap between serving and being sent, from giving some of our time to help the organized mission of the church to seeing really all of life as our mission field, where we're joining God and what He's doing, and being a part of that kingdom agent wherever we might find ourselves.
Yeah, so that's what this series is going to be about, those second two gaps. It's about this gap between volunteering and leading, between serving and being sent. And there's a tool that we're going to use in the video series to help you bridge those gaps. If you're a pastor, maybe help your leaders bridge those gaps. If you're a leader in your church, it's helping you personally bridge those gaps. You're going to see 5 different critical points that need to be developed for you to be someone who's easy to follow. The first is this idea of vision. What's the vision that you're casting? Where are we going? The second is this idea of voice. Who is it that you're speaking to, and who might be the people that would follow you to that place? The third is vocabulary. This is the content. It's the language that you're speaking that is going to help them, make the necessary moves that they need to make, and is going to pave the pathway for what it is that you're going to cover together. The fourth is voyage. It's what the journey looks like, and it's the way that people get transformed, and the way that we as leaders need to help them on the journey through what we're going to call the dip. And finally, there's the vehicle of how we're going to move together and what's that going to look like. All 5 of these components are important for us as leadership. If you're having trouble with people following you, my hunch is probably at least one of these things is missing. So we're going to be covering this piece by piece throughout the video series. But before we could jump into the leadership star, we need to take some time to name the problem specifically in our context. So in video 2, we're going to jump into naming the problem. And all throughout this video series, there's going to be worksheets for you to download that you'll go through with us to help you not only get the information, but be trained in the stuff so that at the end of the course, you're actually increasing your capacity for influence and impact. So we look forward to joining you in video number 2. And in video number 2, we're going to name the problem.